And I'm going to introduce myself and then everybody, and I will begin with the questions. Okay, so you're all very welcome to this discussion that is part of the 2021 Limerick Lifelong Learning Festival and is entitled Literature for Extraordinary Times. My name is Jana Liatzos. I'm a lecturer in English here at the University of Limerick, and I'm also the course director of the MA program in English. I'm very grateful to my colleagues and graduate students in English here at the university for joining in the conversation. We have, in alphabetical order, Dr. Carrie Griffin. Carrie, would you like to wave so that everybody knows who you are? Great. We have Professor Michael Griffin. We have Dr. Niamh Heher. And we have Miss Andreen Tahiro, who completed her MA at the University of Limerick and is currently in her second year of the PhD program here. We are going to have a conversation and a number of questions regarding our own research and teaching of literature in English at UL, especially as this work engages with the topic of extraordinary times, not unlike the kind we have been living through here in Ireland for the past year and a half with COVID-19. So let us start with the question, what comes to mind when you hear the term extraordinary times? And what do you think literature can contribute to our understanding of such times? And Carrie, I may start with you and your response to that question.
Okay. I suppose I could answer that question in a lot of different ways. And of course, our minds immediately, when we hear the term extraordinary times, you know, we immediately go to the present moment and the kind of context in which we're living. But as I was kind of mulling this over, I was also thinking about my work as a medievalist, so a specialist in medieval early modern studies, but also I wanted to kind of think about what makes other times extraordinary. So I suppose we live through things and we may not think that they are extraordinary as we're living through them. And as I'm saying this, I realize we're speaking again in a particular context about the pandemic. That's what's in our minds at the moment. But there are other extraordinary things going on at the moment that I think literature is responding to, and I think we're all kind of tracking and tracing in a way that we've been not able to do in the past. We've there's an immediacy, I suppose, to the extraordinariness of the times that we're living in, and I'm thinking about things like Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, the movement around calling out violence against women, the refugee crisis, the crisis in the climate crisis, and also things like the rise of populism and far right politics. So aside from the pandemic, things are really extraordinary at the moment. But I suppose historically, and I suppose what's interesting about the present moment for me is that is what I've already referred to, that kind of immediacy around the way in which we can kind of respond to what's happening on our TV screens, and how literature, as a kind of an answer to what's happening, is also very immediate. So I'm seeing a lot of emphasis on the spoken word, on spoken word poetry, for example, on music and lyricism, sort of responding in a very profound way to kind of seismic political moments, that seem to be happening globally rather than locally, or maybe locally as well as globally. As a medievalist, my mind immediately went to things like and obviously this has huge resonance with the pandemic, our pandemic. My mind immediately went to the Black Death, and the sort of what an extraordinary moment that must have been for people living in the 1340s and 1350s, and how I think it took literature a while to respond to the profound kind of loss of life that came with that. And obviously, it's a very different time. We live in a very connected digital world, and in the 1340s, people were, it's pre-printing press. People were writing in that very intimate way, using, things that were made, writing implements that were probably made by themselves. And I think the literature, probably of the 1380s and 1390s, is encoding responses to that period in very subtle ways, in very nuanced ways. So you don't have direct responses, but you have to kind of search in the literature for really, really kind of considered responses to something that was not just happening locally, but which for people at the time must have felt like a very local thing. So I suppose extraordinary, the term extraordinary is an interesting one, because it contains the term ordinary. So, or it sort of, for me, feels like our times are, our times are kind of defined as extraordinary by what is affecting our ordinary lives. It just so happens that at the moment, that's happening in a much more kind of global way, in a more connected way. In the Middle Ages, or in the early modern period, when we have periods of plague happening, kind of consistently throughout that period, it must have been quite different. And I think the responses were obviously very different, in those times as well.
Thank you, Carrie. Michael, if I can ask you to gauge the question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. What do we understand by extraordinary times? As Carrie points out, I mean, it's tempting to go straight to the time in which you find yourself, and of course, the time in which you find yourself is extraordinary insofar as it is the time in which you are alive, and there is no other such time. So I think in terms of relating the question to the ordinariness of the the ordinariness within the term extraordinary, we're all the time trying to make sense of our own existence, and I think literature plays a very important role in that. So I think the first thing that we're inclined to look to literature for is to make sense of our existence in the time in which we are living, and also to think about how things can be improved in all of the various realms that Carrie has described there, in terms of gender relations, race relations, in terms of improving the political culture. But like Carrie, I work in an earlier period of literature ordinarily. I try all the time, and I think all of us try to relate what it is that we study to the times in which we find ourselves, and to think about that as a platform for contributing to society in a way which might improve it. But to think about, for instance, the contemporary moment of pandemic. One of the first things that I touched upon with my undergraduate students this year was, and it kind of harkens back to what Carrie was saying about the Black Death, is the plague year of 1665, and one of the great texts, and it's one of the, I suppose it had fallen by the wayside, as a good many texts in the early 18th century tend to do, but it has all sorts of interesting dynamics and elements in it. Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, because it describes some of the very same sorts of experiences that we're having. I was just thinking about what Defoe had to say about it. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of noise here. When the physicians assured us that the danger was as well from the sound, that is the seemingly sound, as the sick, which reminds us that we're thinking about people who are not asymptomatic all the time and as possible carriers of a virus, and that those people who thought themselves entirely free were oftentimes the most fatal, and that it came to be generally understood that people were sensible of it and of the reason of it. Then I say they began to be jealous of everybody, and a vast number of people locked themselves up so as not to come abroad into any company at all. nor suffer any that had been abroad in promiscuous company to come into their houses or near them, at least not so near them as to be within the reach of their breath or of any smell from them. And it's really, you know, he wrote this in 1722, thinking back to 1665, and it resonates with us now. They were obliged to converse at a distance, and they would always have preservatives in their mouths and about their clothes to repel and keep off the infection. So our face masks are clearly being anticipated there by Defoe. So yeah, I think, you know, examples like that just show how extraordinary times then can inform us in our extraordinary times now. And when we think about the early modern and the 18th century period, we're often thinking about issues of you know, race, empire, the relationship between nation and cosmopolitanism as well, because, you know, these the literature, I think throughout history has been a realm within which people have tried to figure out, you know, their own identity as an individual, but also their identity within a group, within a national group, but also how that jostles with, or perhaps exists in tension with, the identities of other peoples. So that's been, you know, that's always been a very important topic in literature. For instance, one of the things I'm very interested in is the middle period of the 18th century, when Britain and France were basically fighting it out for control of America. And of course, there was great national chauvinism in Britain and in France at the time. But some writers began to question that, and they began to question it from a genuinely kind of cosmopolitan point of view, to understand that you can have a particular identity, but that identity needn't necessarily put you at odds with other people. So I think that's also, in terms of the Enlightenment, thinking about the period that I often study, these are important questions. But perhaps I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And what about you, Niamh? What are your thoughts on the question of extraordinary times in literature?
Absolutely, yeah. It's something that would be a key concern of mine in both teaching and in research. I tend to look at the work of contemporary Irish writers, and would also have done a lot of research on the time of the Troubles in the North. So that's a key question there that perhaps I'll expand on later. But one of the things that I find helpful when thinking about this idea of extraordinary times is to draw on trauma theory and the work of theorists who think about what exactly trauma constitutes. And they talk about a breach, and they talk about a lack of comprehensibility, and they talk about an experience that's so outside the ordinary that, you know, we are ill-equipped to digest or to assimilate it. And one of the things that is suggested by trauma theory is that literature has a very particular role there in terms of that whole process of digesting and assimilating. And they liken it to the role of the patient with the psychoanalyst. And so the idea there of the talking cure, that, you know, you through the therapeutic narrative and the retelling of your story, that somehow that allows you to move that experience from something that is incomprehensible to something that's now comprehensible. And they use that template then to describe the ways in which literature can offer the same kind of consolation. And so they talk about the testimony of literature being a kind of way of communally articulating that narrative of experience, which allows then for some digestion of that experience. And of course, that's where literature is key to that whole process. And so from that point of view, you know, we're thinking about literature there as a kind of a communal articulation of experience that hopefully is adequate to the individual as well as the collective experience of that particular moment, which I find really, really interesting. And so if literature is acting as that kind of a mirror, then we look to literature in these extraordinary times as a way of understanding and comprehending what is occurring. And just in terms of the particularities of this particular experience for us all, you know, the pandemic, I mean, one of the things that has marked it is the denial of community, isn't it? That the fact that we've all been isolated, that we haven't had that sort of interaction with others that is so key to our everyday experience of life. And again, I think that leads to a very significant desire collectively for that kind of imaginative community, or that imagined community that literature represents, as a way of, having that conversation, but obviously on a much more collective basis. And so it's going to be really interesting to see. It has already been interesting to see the work that has emerged as part of this experience. And I think that it absolutely reconfirms the importance of literature as a way of us communally understanding these kinds of extraordinary times.
Thank you so much, Niamh. That's the really, I was going to talk about everything that you guys have talked about, so thank you for covering it. Sandrine, if we can turn to you, what are your thoughts as a PhD student now, living through these times and thinking about what it means to think about extraordinary times and the role of literature in relation to them?
Yeah, no, I agree with Michael. Like, I think it's a really interesting question. And when I was preparing for this, like, the first thing that came to mind is just in regards to my research with post-colonialism. So, like, again, how first and second generation African writers were kind of able to capture this specific moment in history, and again, how kind of capturing that amalgamation of lived experiences. But again, that was something that was only unique to, let's say, with the Africans. So by looking at it now and looking at it within the pandemic lens, this is something that it's affecting everyone, as opposed to it being a specific issue for the formerly colonized. Like, we're all have that ability there. So I think with that, like, literature for the first, second, and the third generation African writers, which are emerging now, like with neoliberalism and stuff like that, it's kind of acting as a way to capture this moment in history where we can kind of go back to and understand the lived experiences and that anxiety of the sense of, like, the what's coming next. I think, like, that's where literature has the ability to do that. And I've seen that now, even with COVID, like, this anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow or anything like that. But we've seen that with people capturing it. And as a PhD student, I've seen that with, like, even myself, I know when I'm writing about anything in response to Black Lives Matter, like, just the immediacy of my feeling in the here and now, and looking at it in 2 weeks' time, it's already, like, informed me, like, that fear and anxiety and everything that I've felt. So, like, I think, like, that's where literature has that timeless ability to capture that one specific moment in history, and whether it be small or not, like, it informs us. And again, like, that's where it's going to be a good reference for people to look back on to understand all the different waves of emotion that people have felt during extraordinary times.
Thank you, Sandrine. That's really wonderful, and I think that I have been taking notes like mad, especially for my colleagues covering less contemporary literatures, which I'm less familiar with. And it astounds me how much of what we said is so similar. In terms of the extraordinary being lived in a very local way that Carrie brought up. And then with Michael noting how it seems as though the engagement with extraordinary repeats across different histories and across different cultures in particular ways. And Niamh's notion of trauma theory and lived experience, which Sandrine also echoed, especially in regards to the anxiety of that lived experience as one lives through it. And the only other term, I guess, that I would add to this conversation would be literature functioning as a type of witness, and teaching us how to, in turn, by virtue of us reading it, teaching us how to witness, and capturing the full scope of that witnessing process, especially the ambiguities of witnessing, right? The personal biases that go into the process of witnessing, and the personal configurations of identity that color witnessing in particular ways, and so on and so forth. So that literature has a unique role in that regard, especially when other narratives seem to have a more so-called transparent way or objective way or rational way of witnessing. extraordinary times. Literature tends to go into the more obscure, more ambivalent, more opaque crevices of social imagination and individual identity, and captures those kind of nuances in really compelling ways, I think. So I know that all of you talked a little bit about your own background and your own research, but I'm wondering if you can perhaps talk about how your own research and teaching engage with the topic of literature in extraordinary times in a little bit more detail. If you can bring up some texts that you find particularly interesting, or illuminating in relation to the topic. Let's this time begin with Michael. Michael, you're muted. I'm sorry.
I'll never stop doing that incorrectly. So I mean that's a good question. So in terms of the MA, I teach a few different topics and contribute to a few different modules. So I teach literary theory, and I teach utopian theory and texts, and I also contribute to modules on Irish American literature. So just to give you a sense of how some of that teaching relates to the whole concept of living in extraordinary times. So for instance, in literary theory, one of the things that we try to do is to think about the nature of literature and whether it is timely or it has some sort of a timeless quality. We usually begin with thinking about that very question, because when we think about great works of literature, when we use that term, we're usually associating with particular works a kind of a timelessness. And that's, if you like, a kind of an aesthete's way of looking at literature, thinking about it in terms of its intrinsic qualities and whether or not it's beautiful or particularly well written. But alongside that, we have to think really about how works of literature are timely, that they contribute to our understanding of the world at a particular moment. So through that course, really, we develop a whole sort of conversation, if you like, about the work of literature in relation to history. So I think that provides us with the tools, if you like, to think about literature and its importance in extraordinary times. I mean, the idea of literature helping us to think about what's next, I think that's a really good idea as well, and that's part and parcel of what we do in utopian theory and texts. One of the, if you like, subgenres of utopian thinking is futurism, and we have a long tradition at the University of Limerick, actually, of science fiction studies. One of our recently retired professors, Tom Moylan, was an expert in science fiction and collected a vast array of texts which are in our library. And our colleague Jack Fennell is now working on writing on Irish science fiction, and has written pretty much the definitive study of that topic, or a study which will lead us in further directions, but has really kind of laid the groundwork in terms of collecting so much of what's there already. So thinking about the future in literature, using literature as a kind of a thought experiment to imagine the ways in which things might pan out, or imagining how things can be improved in the future is one of the things that we do in one of our core modules in the MA. And it's, I think, a very interesting sort of set of texts that we look at as well. So, for instance, we look at everything from Thomas More's Utopia back in 1516, again, another early modern text, to Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, right through, the kind of European traditions of, continental European traditions of utopian thinking in France from Voltaire, through to contemporary poetry, and in Germany from Marx through to, science fiction films like Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And then on to kind of more contemporary science fiction writings, like, say, for instance, the novels of Ursula Le Guin. So, these are all kind of thought experiments, or, texts which enable us to think about the future. I also then contribute to a module on Irish American literature. One of the texts that we look at there is the film of The Quiet Man. which seems too bucolic and too pretty to actually enable us to think in any meaningful way about literature in extraordinary times. But in fact, the story of that and the film based upon the story is, I think, an interesting instance of setting a kind of a rural idyll against an industrial background, or contrasting a rural idyll with an industrial background. And that in itself has a kind of utopian dimension to it, which is something that we discuss in terms of the module. When you imagine a better world, what does it look like? Might it indeed look like the rolling hills and peaceful valleys of the quiet man? Or would it look like, a fully functioning high-tech city? These are that's one of the things that we ask students to do is to think about what their own utopias might look like, and some of our creative writing students actually develop utopian blueprints. So these are some of the ideas and some of the texts that we work through in some of the modules that I teach over the course of any given MA year.
That's fabulous, Mike. Thank you. Neve, same question. You're muted, Neve.
Sorry about that. Just one of the modules I would work on in the MA program is a module that is concerned with issues in contemporary poetry. And so I have done a few modules there where we've considered the relationship between poetry and trauma. So one of the things that I'm most concerned with in that module is thinking about, when I spoke earlier about the idea of literature acting as a kind of an imaginative space where, the experience can be articulated in a helpful way. What we do on that module is that we really interrogate how that occurs. And so in particular, I'd look at the work of poets from Northern Ireland. So I would have done my own PhD on the work of Maeve McGuckian. And so she was writing during the time of the Troubles. And obviously, clearly, that's a huge theme in her work. But also, we would look at the work of Seamus Heaney and Michael Longley and others. And Seamus Heaney is such an extraordinary example of a poet who feels this really intense obligation to respond. It's a very almost an ethical obligation on his part. And I think that's very much reflective of, a tendency in Irish literature, in Irish poetry in particular, to become the kind of spokesperson for your community. We would have seen that in the work of Yeats and many others. In fact, it goes much further back than that. But just in terms of Seamus Heaney's work, when we look at how you respond as a poet to extraordinary times, to the actual lived experience of those extraordinary times, we see in his work this extraordinary tension between the desire to articulate that experience and also, because it's poetry, a tendency towards the transcendent moment, which is a moment that is very often linked to the notion of reconciliation and some sort of solace. And that is keenly apparent in his work. And it's something that he talks a lot about in his own writings as well as in his poetry. And, this desire to find the words that are adequate to that experience, to, honestly reflect his community's experience of a particular moment. And then his consideration of whether poetry can act as a kind of a poultice, can act as some kind of a curative source for the community. Now, he falls short of suggesting that poetry can entirely resolve, because obviously that would be asking an awful lot of it. But he talks instead in terms of poetry performing a kind of a magic dance of transformation. And it's a really beautiful way of thinking about it. And you also see that reflected in the work of Michael Longley, who comes from a different tradition and yet has that same impulse. And he talks about, the absolute obligation, the foundational obligation to respond, which is the poet's place or role in society. And he then talks about how, as a poet, you have to respond imaginatively, and the sort of obligations that come with that, because this is a really, this is really important. You're writing during the time of the Troubles. You have to be careful about what you write. And of course, Longley and Heaney would have been criticised for getting it wrong sometimes, but there's no doubt that there's a genuine desire on their part to get it right. But it's a very difficult formulation. And when you look then on that module, I'd look then at the work of Yvonne Boland as a Southern poet who also addresses the Troubles, obviously, in poems like A Child of Our Time. And she really interestingly responds to a question that the critic Sandra Gilbert poses about what poetry does, you know, and so Gilbert's question is, can poetry console a grieving public? And Yvonne Boland responds to that question by saying, you know, quite hopefully, yes, that there is that dimension to poetry. And she talks there very interestingly about how the sort of the tradition of the elegy in poetry is foundational, you know, that was a kind of a collective mourning, an articulation of grief that was hopefully helpful to the community. And Yvonne Boland absolutely argues then for that being, you know, one of the sort of primary roles of poetry is that attempt to offer consolation. And so it's a huge task, and it's one that is not easily achieved. But one of the really good examples of that being achieved would be, I would argue, the poet Paula Meehan and her poem, The Statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks, because that's a poem about Anne Lovett's tragic death, her death and her son's death in Granard. And somehow Meehan does manage to capture very keenly a collective sense of the grief about that particular event. And so it's very often named as one of Ireland's favourite poems, because it in some way spoke to the individual experience. I mean, that's one of the things Boland talks about, is that pact between the poet and the public. And Meehan manages to do it in that poem in a way that is really profoundly important, and certainly an excellent example of how poetry can console. And then if you think about the awful revelations about the Magdalen laundries in Ireland and the trauma associated with that, and you look at the work of Eileen de Quillinon, and in her poetry, in poems such as Translations and Besborough, she again tries to articulate that communal grief in a way that is helpful, that is reflective of the trauma, but also, and this is the thing about poetry, poetry doesn't just record, it also anticipates some sort of resolution, tentatively perhaps, but it's certainly very much part of the whole project of poetry, that transcendent moment would be part of it. So on that module, it's really interesting to look at, you know, obviously I'm talking there within an Irish context, but we would also look at maybe poetry after 9/11. We'd look at, you know, Russian poetry, Anna Akhmatov and people like that. And again, their place as, you know, chroniclers of traumatic or extraordinary times, but also hopefully as people who can offer some kind of consolation, let's say, for that grieving public at those times.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Niamh. That sounds so interesting. I want to take all of your modules if I weren't teaching mine. Sandrine, what about you? What are some, how does your research, and I know that you don't teach as such, but you are a teaching assistant in undergraduate modules. So if you can talk a little bit about your approach in your research and some of the teaching that you're doing in regards to literature in extraordinary times.
Yeah, so for the undergrad, I tutor in post-colonialism with your class, and then British literature since 1945 with Niamh's class as well. And even in that, like especially one of the books, our last book that we looked at was Autumn by Alice Smith. And again, the students really engaged with that because the backdrop of that was Brexit, and there were so many different things that were coming into effect, and one of them was like the changing nature of what it means to be British, especially from, let's say, from like a Black perspective. And again, that's what we were talking about, like how Alice Smith's ability to kind of capture that tension of the changing nature of identity. And in my own research, like I look at the Anthropocene in regards to climate change and the concept of futurity, like with what Michael was saying in regards to our approach to the future. So I think like even in my own research, I can see how literature really functions as a way to engage me in like how African writing is constantly changing, and how contemporary African writers that I had mentioned, so like such as Helen Habila or Zakes Meda, like in regards to his writing in The Heart of Redness, where again he captures this, taps into this tension about how like with writers such as Hegel, where like they describe how like Africans are stuck in a mythic state of existence, or like in this timeless nature. and again how contemporary African writers are writing back on that, and again showcasing how Africans are able to move in time, but in their own extraordinary ways, such as proverbs, folk tales, and anything like that. So again, these are, it kind of amalgamates how processing like someone's lived experiences can be done in such multiple angles, and again how that informs researchers like such as myself on how like to kind of move beyond that and look at it in an imaginative way. And I think even within the African context, like I think when Michael was talking about like in regards to science fiction and this utopian idea, like it just reminds me of just the film Pumzi, which again is a science fiction where it looks at Africa in occupying the Third World War in regards to the water shortages. So again, even that's a really clever way of implementing climate change and that anxiety of like what's going to happen next in a really imaginative way that kind of departs from this Western discourse of how like Africa is always going to be catching up. And that's where again African writers and filmmakers and everything like that are engaging in these debates now to showcase how they are capturing these extraordinary times in their own alternative ways to kind of show and showcase this alternative future that again like just departs from what we in the West call as actual time. So it kind of plays on that sense of like timeless and extraordinary times because they're showcasing their own unique way. So again, like it's just something that's so interesting to look at now as a PhD student, because I know even by the time I finish, that's going to change again and again. So again, but I'll be able to reflect back on that, because by looking at futurity, you have to look back in the past, like with the colonialism and everything like that, and to how that lived experiences and that African aspiration and lived experiences have all been described in a really nuanced ways. And I think like that's where literature comes in by, again, like showcasing this power of words and power of capturing like a specific moment in time.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sandrine. That sounds really exciting. And what about you, Carrie? Same question.
Thanks, Yana. One of the modules that I work on with other colleagues, including Niamh, is the module on the MA program that produces the literary journals, where students come together, students of English and creative writing, and produce the journal, which is called the Omstone. And Sandrine is a former editor, actually. A really interesting module that teaches students lots of different skills, but it's been particularly interesting working on it in this extraordinary time, I think, for two reasons. I think the first one that I would identify is that it's challenging to produce literature, to kind of, to produce something that is, a physical book in a time like this. So as a group, we've had to find strategies to deal with that and to kind of practically overcome that, and to think through in a very mindful way and also a very practical way what the best way to bring literature to people at this time might be, and how people want to read literature or how people want to experience literature. And I think that's happening in various ways, very, very interesting ways. But also, and I was very struck by what you were saying and what my colleagues have been saying about witnessing and sort of, the idea of timely literature as well. Also, we're kind of seeing firsthand, because we're receiving submissions, hundreds of submissions from people writing in different contexts, for, on this island and globally. We're seeing immediate responses to not just the pandemic, but things like the climate crisis. We're seeing lots of literature that's being produced around grief, around isolation, literature that is responding to political situations, different political situations. And, I was very struck when you was talking about Paula Meehan, and Paula Meehan's work is so influential and so powerful, that we've got a number of works in the current issue, the current 2021 Omstone, which is in production at the moment, that are talking about in very lyrical ways and in very kind of profound ways about the relationship between church and state, and how damaging that has been, and how traumatic that has been for us as a nation. But we've also got, we're also seeing literature and kind of seeing firsthand how many people are, how many, or to what extent people are kind of slowing down and experiencing their locality and kind of, reconnecting with nature, reconnecting with their little part of the world, and making extraordinary literature out of that. And I think that has been a very unique experience in the context of the pandemic, especially because we're all, as there's a big group of students working on the Omstone, and we all interact in the way in which we're interacting now on a screen. So putting a literary journal together and kind of, deciding how we want to curate the literature that we're reading, the pieces that we've chosen, has been at once the kind of a communal experience, but also weirdly isolating and sort of mediated in a very particular way. So that module has been a very interesting experience for all of us, and has, I think, caused us to reflect not just on a bit more keenly on the kind of job we're doing, the job of producing a literary journal, but on how important writing seems to be for people when dealing with, witnessing, recording, responding to moments of crisis. And elsewhere, I suppose, in my own teaching, and this kind of relates to some of what Mike has been saying as well about Defoe and about timely literature. I've just finished up teaching the first year module on early modern literature, and I finished my teaching by looking at John Milton's work. And it really struck me that this year in particular, perhaps, I thought Milton differently, because I was looking at some of his elegies, so some of his works of mourning, his works of commemoration, and thinking about how important commemoration is now and will be, I suppose, in the years to come. And we also looked at two different pieces of writing, and this might kind of step into some of the other things that we might discuss, I think, about interdisciplinarity. We looked a little bit at Milton's defense of the regicide. So Milton was a Republican who probably witnessed the execution of Charles I in 1649, and supported the Cromwellian project, the theocracy, the great kind of Republican parliamentary republic that Cromwell tried to establish. So Milton's kind of immediate response to that was to write a kind of political tract that defended the regicide. And after the Restoration of Charles II, Milton began to write Paradise Lost, which is his kind of other response to that extraordinary event, that seismic moment in British history. Quite a different response, but and one that we probably need to excavate in certain ways in order to recover that set of responses that Milton might be having to that failed kind of experiment in governance. But it really struck me that there was a sort of really nice way of looking at how Milton's work is kind of patterned and can be kind of almost set against a timeline of these amazing events in history. So it just felt different to teach that work this year, because I found myself consistently sort of referring to the times we're living in now, but also trying to get the students to imagine what it must have been like to topple, a centuries-old institution in kind of in the way in which statues were being toppled recently in a symbolic way in places like Bristol. So it's been an interesting time to teach texts like that, I think.
Thank you, Carrie. It's so interesting that you bring that up, because I know from teaching my modules, which are far more contemporary. I teach 2 postgraduate modules on human rights and postcolonial literature, very contemporary texts and scholarship, that for a lot of students, the past looms mythological. Like they have a sense that all time outside their own historical lived experience, and perhaps their parents, maximum, it's kind of lumped into the same experience. So if you're talking about the ancient Greek gods, or you're talking about, Milton's Paradise Lost, it's really comparable. We're all talking about same roundabout events unfolding in time. There is a resistance to historical knowledge and to an understanding that history was a lived experience in the present moment that it was unfolding, right? There is an allocation of it to an archival awareness that strips it from any affective qualities, from any anxieties, from any struggles at the present moment that it was unfolding, like I said. And I love, all your modules sound incredible, and so does your research. The only one thing that I would add to everything that you talked about, and I love some of your very lyrical articulations, by the way, literature as a thought experiment, or poetry performing a magic dance of transformation. This is lovely language. But I'm loving this idea of the experiment and the transformation and the transition as key variables of exactly what is so valuable about literature's engagement with extraordinary times. Because I think, at least in my teaching and research on post-colonial writing and, again, human rights predicaments and human rights discourse, what I'm interested in is precisely how to find language to capture transformation, when transformation necessarily entails a departure from that which is known, or that which is lived, or that which we identify with. So how do we depart from the language that we rely on to communicate our ideas? And where do we go? How do we communicate this other that we're experiencing as we're transforming, as we engage in a period of transitional politics or transitional experience in our own lives, or transitional identities, and so on and so forth. And so I find that literature is a unique type of narrative precisely because it has that poetic license to engage the experimental, the imaginative, and take flights of fancy that are very performative, and they are very puzzling and confusing. I find that in my teaching, one of the resistances that I get often by my students is the resistance to incomprehensibility. They want to make sense of what it is we're reading or what it is we're doing. And they want to distill it and capture it and understand it and rationalize it and pigeonhole it, taxonomize it in a particular kind of way so they can understand it and process it and metabolize it in their way of thinking. And literature, the literature at least that I find most compelling and I like to teach, is the one that unsettles that kind of desire. And in unsettling this desire to control and understand, perhaps invites us to think otherwise in these kind of ways that are uncomfortable in the beginning, but eventually become an interesting thought experiment, an interesting feeling experiment in many ways, right? So what becomes oftentimes a very frustrating body of students in the beginning of the semester, fingers crossed by the end, becomes much more excited by the struggles that they face with the text, and much more thrilled with the challenges that literature posits for their thinking and feeling. So we are very close to running out of time. So I would like to then wrap up with perhaps discussing very briefly about kinds of literary projects that you find exciting at the present moment. And they may have to do with COVID-19 or may not, but again, in your own research or awareness of literature engaging with extraordinary times that you're following. So Neve, should we start with you this time?
Yes, absolutely. I think what I'm finding most interesting, I've worked with Carrie on the Ohmstone, which was very fascinating to see the work that was emerging, as Carrie has said, during lockdown. And I think we're going to have some incredible works to look forward to. I'm reminded of the poem by Felly Speaks. It was featured on RTE on one of the primetime broadcasts. This is going back to last year now, but in this poem, she really beautifully articulates the experience of COVID. It's a poem called Still, and it just captures something. And again, there was a really powerful response, public response to that poem, which suggests that she had found the adequate words, because as you're saying, sorry, Jana, it is very difficult sometimes to find the words that will, accurately depict a particular experience. And also when we saw Amanda Gorman speaking at Joe Biden's inauguration, again, I really find it inspiring that it seems to me as if poetry's place is being reconfirmed all the time, the importance of poetry and, the place that poetry has in our community and the role that it plays, in capturing very immediate, extraordinary moments, but also, reflecting on them in a way that will hopefully be helpful for everyone concerned. So I'm really looking forward to the work that's going to emerge. And I know that, as Carrie has said, the work that is contained in the Omstone this edition certainly attests to that, to the I suppose maybe the extended reflective space people have had during isolation and lockdown, that hopefully it will produce some absolutely brilliant works of poetry and other types of literature. So that's what I'd be looking forward to in that respect.
Wonderful. Thank you, Niamh. Yes, this 2021 issue of the Omstone, we're all waiting very eagerly to get our hands on it or access it digitally. I don't know what kind of format that will take, but it does sound fascinating, and I'm very eager now to see it. Sandrine, same question?
Yeah, I agree with Niamh. I think just now with the pandemic, it's kind of brought about like how writing is, like, as you stated, like a form of witnessing. But I just think for me personally, like in regards to the extraordinary times, it's kind of showcased a new way of activism. So like I'm like working on something now, like where again, I want to use to see how writing is a form of activism, because again, like we're all indoors, so like you can't really go out to the streets or anything like that. And again, it's just that it's things that I've been playing around, like that anxiety of like, again, like the changing nature of the Irish identity, the way we're seeing Black Lives Matter like re-emerging. So like kind of capturing that moment in time and adding on COVID with that. So I think it has really caused, and I've seen this just on Twitter, like that's why I'm just inspired by just seeing how people are just, again, like they're not even writers or activists or anything like that, but they're just able to just capture a specific moment in time. So I really want to kind of tap into that and kind of collect all that amalgamation of these anxieties that people are feeling, but then look at it through like the activism lens. So I think that's where COVID has really showcased like just a new way of, again, just being like vocal about things that you're passionate about without being loud on the street or anything like that. So I think that's where literature is going to really showcase a new way of that. And I've seen like there's this presenter on RTE, Ola Mijinko, and like she's written a poem like on being Black and Irish, but she's written it in both English and Irish. So again, like it's kind of showcasing how, and like she has no background in writing, and like she's always talked about like how it's just the fact that you're just in your house and you're just like just writing things down and they're kind of making sense. So I'm kind of like, I'm really excited about just tapping into how writing is a form of activism. And again, we wouldn't have been able to look at that without COVID and being placed inside and just looking at how literature can function as a way of kind of healing, but solidarity with other people as well.
Very nice, Sandrine. Thank you very much. Carrie?
Yeah, I agree completely with Niamh and Sandrine. I think what's really, really interesting for me is the sort of immediacy of the literature. So I'm really interested in research in how literature is produced and the context for production of literature. And I think it's really interesting at the moment that people are sitting at their kitchen tables and uploading videos of themselves speaking. And I'm thinking of Imelda May's poem, "You Don't Get to Be Racist," which I just thought was incredibly powerful. And I loved that she was in her kitchen doing that and bringing it to people, as soon as it's recorded. So that for me is one of the most exciting things that's happening at the moment, that the ways in which literature is being produced is, the way in which literature is being produced is really shifting. It's using new technologies, it's using social media platforms to get it out to the audience that needs to hear it and needs to see it. And I also think I agree with Niamh that poetry is, in particular, is moving. It's kind of moving into a place where it's aligning itself with leadership and with what we need to hear as a nation. I don't think it's any accident, actually, that our current president, who has shown great leadership at this time, is a poet, you know, and hearing him speak to the nation and using poetry to do that, I think has been very, very profound. I also think that it's very, very exciting that spoken word, I've referred to this already, spoken word poetry is a thing now. And that there's a really, that for me kind of signals a return to the origins of poetry, the lyrical origins, but also there's again, music is kind of finding a voice and offering another way, another platform in which we can kind of work through those big issues that as a society we're dealing with. And I'm thinking about people like Denise Chyla, who's a UL alumna, actually, whose music really combines, you know, spoken word poetry with her music. You know, she weaves in spoken word poetry into her performances, I should say. I also really like the sort of curation of responses to the pandemic, in particular, in platforms like Pendemic. So this kind of collective, you know, impulse to bring together writing from all sorts of different places, curating it in one place, online, making it freely available to people, as a signal that I think people need literature. They need to write and they need to read in these times.
That's great. Thank you, Carrie. What about you, Michael?
Yeah, I just like to agree with what everybody's been saying. I think this is, like we were talking about, extraordinary times. These are exciting times as well, given that I think people have become more adept at using different media because we've been forced into it. And that has a kind of a negative connotation. But you think then about precisely the sorts of things that you're speaking about there, about, you know, the performance of poetry, the kind of the democratization of realms within which we can exchange ideas about poetry, the fact that we can now attend readings in another part of the world via the very technology that we're using here. You know, in our theory course, we talk about Walter Benjamin, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And, you know, there's great danger in certain technologies, but also great possibility as well. And I think these extraordinary times have provided us with an opportunity to think about technology in a positive way as a moment of potentially of democratization of knowledge, with some attendant dangers, which I think, you know, any kind of postgraduate study or study generally provides us with the critical skills to think about at the same time. So what we're always engaged with, I think, in the study of literature and the study of media and culture generally, is possibility alongside thinking about the threats that are out there. And I think that kind of critical thinking is always going to be valuable.
Yeah, these were all such fabulous insights that you all brought to bear to this question. And I would say that I have found it very interesting, just to continue with the issue that Mike brought up about the things that have been made available to us through technology during these times. This past year, academic year, where we were not allowed to have face-to-face classes, at least physical classes, I thought it would be quite isolating, and I thought it would take away from the educational experience and from my experience as an educator to teach these classes. And I found the contrary to actually have been the case. I found it not the contrary. It's not like I'm deprived when I have face-to-face classes, but nothing was compromised. If anything, I found really exciting new ways of teaching. You know, I was teaching, for example, these modules again on human rights in the fall and post-colonialism in the spring. And I had students tuning in from South Asia, from Italy, from Austria, from Algeria, from the United States. And there is something different that is brought to the table when the space that you occupy and from which you speak about something that is extraordinary, that tackles the extraordinary or the transformational, is different, and so and pressing. So I found that the conversations we're having were very rich. And similarly, I have attended conferences all over the world, and keynote speeches, all, in South Africa, in Ghana, in South Asia, in the United States, in Brazil, that I would never have been able to attend before. So I find that the contrary, that it's almost, if you go into this space, it's the contrary experience to the isolation. It's almost, it becomes too busy, right? So, and it becomes overwhelming in that regard. And of course, it is important to recognize that in order to access all of these things that are made available, one has to have a stable internet access and a computer and time away from childcare obligations and other personal obligations. So I'm not trying to put on rose colored glasses and pretend that everything is hunky-dory in the time of a pandemic. I'm just saying that there is exciting stuff that is happening out there, and potentials for connection that are truly quite revolutionary, I find, and quite radical in their tendency towards democratization in a way that has realized the potential of the internet that so many have been waxing lyrical about, probably for the first time in the last 20 years that the internet has become so big, at least in the West. I recognize that in other pockets of the world, such as the Middle East and North Africa with Arab Spring or Iran, social media has been used in the past in similar ways. In any case, thank you all for coming and partaking in this very exciting conversation. I could have you all here for at least another couple of hours to talking about your work and your thoughts on this topic of literature for extraordinary times. Thank you again so very much for being here today.
Thanks, Yana. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Yana. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.